I want to bring in my next guest, the US Studies Centre's Foreign Policy and Defence Director, Ashley Townshend. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Patricia.
So what do you make of Australia's decision today?
Look, it's an understandable, unsurprising, but very disappointing decision. And that is because although it's true that Australia has deep interest in freedom of navigation, and in terms of our energy security requirements, we have specific interest in the Straits of Hormuz, the entire potential crisis in the Straits of Hormuz is an utterly avoidable crisis. Were the Trump administration to return to a sensible path of diplomacy, as Australia, like Europeans, should be urging it to do so, we wouldn't have to be having this conversation and facing this question right now.
OK, but Australia's commitment here is minimal. One ship that's already in the area and a surveillance plane. Does that suggest our role will be pretty limited? Does that sort of deal with any of your concern around this?
Look, it does, and Australian officials must be given great credit for finding a way to essentially make an offer that would be politically acceptable to Washington, that would minimise also the drain and the commitment by Australian forces. It's not clear exactly what the command arrangements will be. It's not clear exactly how long the naval task group, or rather the naval surface ship, will be over there in January next year. The Prime Minister has said 6 months. We'll see if that happens. But in terms of the size of the commitment, it is minimal, and that is a good thing. But let's put this in broader perspective. We have been a part of minimal contributions in the Middle East for diplomatic reasons that made a lot of sense, and also for diplomatic reasons that didn't make a lot of sense more recently, for nearly 20 years. It's cost the Australian taxpayer in excess of $14 billion since 9/11, and in that time we've spent less than $4 billion on operations here in the Indo-Pacific. That really has to change.
Australia has articulated some of the reasons. The Prime Minister has talked about this today. Our economic interests, fuel security, for instance. You don't buy that argument?
As I said at the start, Patricia, they're all valid reasons, but let's go to the heart of the problem. Scene one of this crisis is Donald Trump pulling out of the Iran deal for political reasons. Now, that was a good deal. It wasn't a perfect deal, but it was a deal that satisfied the international community, that would keep Iran from nuclearizing in the foreseeable future. It wasn't perfect, and it didn't cover everything else. It didn't cover the sorts of geopolitical misdemeanors that Iran has been engaging in more broadly in the Middle East. And don't get me wrong, none of this is to excuse the threats and perhaps the actions that Iran has already taken to jeopardize or challenge freedom of navigation and movement in the Straits of Hormuz. But these things need to be understood in their proper context. Were the Trump administration to have stuck to the Iran deal, Australia wouldn't have had to face this choice. And the United States also wouldn't have had to face this choice.
At the start of the week, you released a report warning Australia should rebalance military deployments away from the Middle East in the face of China's rising strength in the Indo-Pacific. Which is ironic given this decision's now been made. Is this the right allocation of Australia's defence budget?
This is not the right part of the world for Australia to be getting more engaged in. It's the right part of the world for Australia to be scaling back its commitments, and for allowing other coalition partners, principally those in Europe who haven't really pulled their weight in the Middle East sufficiently, to be allowing them to take a greater lift in the Middle East, and also to be working with the Americans to encourage them to see that if the Trump administration's very good 2018 national defence strategy is to be implemented, and it's a strategy that says China really is the principal strategic competitor for the United States, and the US military has a long way to go before it's prepared for that crisis, and that challenge rather, then it needs to focus on major power competition. It needs to focus on modernising the force, and it needs to stop investing large numbers of US capabilities and resources, to say nothing of ours, in wars that are preventable, in wars that are not in the broader critical national strategic interests of either the United States or Australia.
What did you make of the timing of the announcement? And the Prime Minister's going to the White House next month. There was some speculation he may make the announcement there. He clearly has brought it forward. What do you make of the timing?
Look, it's a hard one to read, really, Patricia, what explains the timing here. I think there was clearly an interest in delaying this decision as long as possible. And in fact, the time frame on actually when the Australian commitment will begin, with a vague commitment to deploying the P-8 anti-submarine warfare aircraft for only 1 month sometime later this year, and then next year for the already scheduled frigate deployed to the Middle East to be relocated to freedom of navigation duties. That tells you that really this is not a critical a crisis that is happening and playing out in the short term. It tells you that this is something that the Australian government feels should be narrowly defined and constrained in terms of rules of engagement and scope. And I think the Prime Minister's announcement now potentially signals that it was a safer bet and a surer bet to put our cards on the table now than wait to Washington. Who knows what exactly the President would have demanded.
The Prime Minister denied Australia was being tied to another US-led military effort in the Middle East. But is there a danger we could be drawn in if there is an escalation? Is that your fear? I mean, he's obviously limiting it, and the language he's using is really key here. He's basically trying to say it's not about other decisions. It's not about, essentially, he didn't put it this way, but it's not about regime change.
No, it's not about regime change, and the Prime Minister is absolutely right to point that out. It is sensible, as I've said, to narrow the scope of this Australian deployment. And I'm not particularly concerned by the prospects of escalation. There's always a risk of escalation. Of course, we don't know what the contingency plans are or the rules of engagement are around, for example, if Australian ship hits a sea mine or is fired upon, and so on and so forth. There are always risks involved. My principal concern is the broader issue of sustained long-term commitments at great cost to not just the Australian taxpayer, but more importantly, at great cost to our own strategic interests and to the United States' own more important strategic interests, the opportunity costs that the Middle East continues to impose on our ability to have resources available for focusing on what matters most, and what matters most is the Indo-Pacific.
15% of the crude oil and 30% of the refined oil that Australia imports passes through the Strait of Hormuz, which is pretty significant. I've raised this issue with you before, but that economic interest for Australia, given our own issues around supply, is quite key though, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And once again, I would suggest that we do have a formula for addressing this potential risk to energy supply lines emanating from the Straits of Hormuz, and that is at the diplomatic table. We don't know whether or not the Australian government has placed any conditions on the Australian deployment to the Middle East. A sensible condition may well have been to say to the Trump administration, and to say privately to the Trump administration, that we'll contribute to a freedom of navigation mission, operation in the Persian Gulf, if you return to the diplomatic table and if you return to a sensible course of negotiations with the Iranian regime. This is really where this crisis began, and it's really where this crisis must end. Of course, were we talking about a different scenario, about a rising Middle Eastern hegemon or a belligerent Iran that itself tore up the deal and wanted to threaten international shipping by undertaking offensive operations or mining operations in the Straits of Hormuz, then of course I wouldn't be making these arguments here today. Of course, if the threat is different and if it's one that is posing a challenge that can't be resolved through diplomacy, then Australian forces ought to be and need to be involved because of our, as you say, clear economic and energy interests in what happens in the Straits of Hormuz. But once again, this is an avoidable crisis.
Just on the escalation risk here, how will the Middle East, how will specifically Iran respond? What is your prediction or potentially your fear around that?
Look, my sense here is that Iran clearly doesn't want any form of escalation. Iran is desperately trying to maintain some sort of balance here whereby it's using threats and calculated threats in order to signal its own pain and signal its own potential willingness to push things further if diplomacy is not the order of the day. But in fact, it's not in Iran's interests to have a crisis. Iran signed the JCPOA for good reasons. The United States under the Obama administration did too, with the support of the international community. No one wants escalation here. And really, you could frame this differently as a tale of two aspects of the rules-based order. The diplomatic agreement that Iran and the Obama administration agreed to and signed, and the freedom of navigation on the high seas, which is of course enshrined in international law and something which matters a lot to Australia. They're both principles that we should hold firm, and they're both being challenged here by the actions of both parties, and there is a sensible course for both parties to de-escalate. That's not leverage at the military domain, that's diplomacy at the boardroom table.
Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Patricia.
And that's the US Studies Centre's Foreign Policy and Defence Director, Ashley Townshend.